Throughout history, whenever people accumulate large fortunes, the question arises of how much of it they should share with others. Should they give away some of the benefits of their good fortune, or hand it down to their descendants? How much should they give to the church or other religious institutions? Should they build buildings or endow foundations which will keep their names alive long after they have gone? How much of it should the state take away in the form of tax? These questions are once again urgent as disparities of wealth and income become ever more extreme. Breaking Views recently noted that the top 0.0001% of the world's population now have estimated assets equivalent to 13% of global GDP. Back in 1987, that figure was 3%. And that is before the artificial intelligence boom enriches a new crop of tech tycoons whose inventions threaten to displace large numbers of jobs. In cash-strapped countries like France and Britain, politicians are once again debating the merits of wealth taxes. Billionaires like Warren Buffett and Bill Gates have pledged to give away the vast majority of their fortunes, but others are less generous. Meanwhile, every week seems to bring a new story of a banker or CEO who's relocating in search of a lower tax bill. This raises the question of whether it's possible to persuade wealthy people to share the benefits of their fortune, and what might encourage them to do so. That's the question we're going to discuss on The Big View this week. It's what we do at Reuters Breaking Views. We tap our best sources around the world for fresh insights into the most pressing questions in business, finance, and economics. I'm your host, Peter Thal Larsen. To talk about all of this, I'm joined by John Studzinski. John is a financier who has worked for some of the world's largest banks and asset managers: Morgan Stanley, HSBC, Blackstone, and now the fund management giant PIMCO, where he is vice chairman. But he's also known as an active philanthropist, giving not just money, but also time to charities in areas such as the arts, homelessness, and human rights. John has laid out his philosophy about charity in a new book. It's called A Talent for Giving, Creating a More Generous Society That Benefits Everyone. And he joins me in the studio in London's Canary Wharf. John Studzinski, welcome to The Big View.
Very good to be here, Peter. Nice to see you again.
So I want to talk a little bit about your book to begin with, because a lot of people who have been successful in business and finance and get to a certain age, they write memoirs, imparting lessons about what they've learned in their careers and so forth. I mean, you haven't done that. The book doesn't really talk about your experience very much at all. So why did you leave all this out?
I've been on Wall Street now for over 45 years. I've been blessed with working with wonderful firms: Morgan Stanley, HSBC, Blackstone, and now for the last 8 years, PIMCO. My focus and really my career has been on relationships, advice, which are based on trust. And I think, like anything else, if I was really going to talk about my career, I was going to talk about my clients. And I think those relationships are still very much privileged between my firm, my client, and myself. So I've really never felt it was that great of interest to anyone. And also, the focus of this book is really on a very important part of my life, which is something I've been doing since I was 6 years old, which is how do you factor giving into your lifestyle.
So we'll talk about the book and some of the sort of the thoughts you have there in a bit. But let's just I'm just curious, I'm just interested in a little bit. This is a podcast about finance and business, and just a little bit interested in that background. What took you into Wall Street, into finance to begin with? Why did you choose that as a career?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question, and it's that wonderful word serendipity. It was serendipity. I was thinking seriously of being a medical doctor. I had gone that route for a period of time, and it was really only through chance that I went to a drinks reception hosted by Morgan Stanley at the business school at the University of Chicago, and they met me, and I met them. And they asked me if I'd interview, and I said, well, I'd already accepted a job at McKinsey, and I felt that was not appropriate. But they said, well, just come anyway. So they flew me to New York 2 days later, and I really liked. What I liked most about the Morgan Stanley culture was it was a group of diverse individuals who were really doing interesting things on Wall Street, but they were also doing interesting things with a lot of diversion in their own lives. And I thought, this is an interesting culture. So I remember interviewing for a whole day at Morgan Stanley, and there was a rigorous process called a 2-on-1 where 2 people interview you. And you get this question, tell us why you want to be an investment banker. And I said, well, actually, I don't know whether I want to be an investment banker. You invited me. I'm here to understand your culture because I'm interested in your culture. I don't know anything about the industry. I don't know anything about Wall Street. But I do know that it seems to be about trust, relationships, and advice. And they made me a job offer within a week. And somehow the word got out that I was talking to Morgan Stanley, and I quickly was asked to interview at Goldman Sachs. I decided not to. And I accepted the job offer at Morgan Stanley, which is really we all have epiphany moments, transformational moments, and it really was important because had I not gone to Morgan Stanley, I would have not been asked to go to London to kick off our M&A business in Europe, and I would not really have developed a much broader perspective on international business. And actually, Peter, I would say the opposite is also true. Had I stayed in New York, I'm not so sure I would have been that interesting or interested in with a plain vanilla career on New York-based Wall Street. I found the experience of what was happening then in Europe, what was happening then in the Mideast, to be much more interesting, and the role that Morgan Stanley was playing.
And moving to London in what was it, sort of in the mid-'80s, basically?
83.
Yeah. So, quite early on. Morgan Stanley was not a well-known name at that point. I mean, someone told me a story about being working at Morgan Stanley in those days and going to a meeting, going to meet a British company, and arriving at the offices and the assistant phoning up and saying, Mr. Morgan and Mr. Stanley are here to see you, right? Because it just people hadn't heard of this firm very much.
Well, I had a whole series of experiences like that. I remember at the time we had with our chairman at the time, Robert Baldwin. I was visiting Nestle in Vevey, Switzerland. And it was just the 2 of us. And we had a very good meeting, 45 minutes, promising. At the end of the meeting, we stood up. The chairman looked at Bob Baldwin and said, I'm looking forward to doing business with Morgan Grenfell. And I said, let's sit down for 5 minutes. And then we had to explain the history of Morgan Stanley, Glass-Steagall, Morgan Grenfell, and then also, remember, Morgan Guarantee.
And Morgan Grenfell was the UK merchant bank, right, which had sort of come out of that.
Yes.
But many, many decades
But remember,
before.
in Wall Street, then you had Morgan Guarantee, which becomes obviously this great JP Morgan. You had Morgan Stanley. And remember, Glass-Steagall, 1933-34, actually separated the investment banking business, the underwriting business, from the financing business. And that's what happened in Glass-Steagall. And that's how the Morgans became sort of decoupled. And then you had the UK version of that, which was Morgan Grenfell, which came from Junius Morgan and George Peabody, which was started in the middle of the 19th century. So I had years of going to meetings of explaining the difference of the three. And it was always very amusing. And of course, once it happened, twice it happened, and the third time I started the meeting by saying, let me explain who we are and who we aren't and why we're here.
So you were Morgan Stanley in London, building up the business, and grew a lot. And then in 2004, you make the leap to HSBC. What was why did you leave Morgan Stanley? What was the thinking there?
Well, it's interesting. I wish I had given myself a lot of the advice that I give many. I mentor lots and lots of people on their careers. And one of the things I mentor people out is when you're operating in your comfort zone, if you think you're operating in your comfort zone and you're not growing, you're not challenged, you're not learning, you're not doing something new, you've got to push yourself out of your comfort zone, which may mean you either change jobs within the same firm or you find a job in another firm. I would say I was probably operating in my comfort zone for far too many years. I probably could have left after 20 years. So I was curious to do something different. I thought it would be very interesting to work under the leadership of, I actually targeted John Bond because I thought he was a very interesting leader. And I also was aware of the fact that HSBC was looking for some leadership at that point in their wholesale and commercial bank and investment bank. So I thought it was an interesting opportunity for me to basically make a change and push myself out of my comfort zone.
So you were HSBC, then you went to Blackstone, and now to PIMCO. I mean, so long career in finance. I think probably 4 decades, if I'm
well, over 45 years.
Yeah, over 45 years.
Yeah.
Right.
So remember, we started in 1980, and we're now in 2025, and I still work full time. I'm very happy at PIMCO, and I'm coming up on my 8th year.
So the external perception of the financial industry broadly defined, and particularly sort of since the 2008 crisis, I think people have become quite aware of on the one hand the sort of the large sums that people earn in that business, and also perhaps a sense that maybe this is not a wholly good force for good in society. I just wonder, sort of operating from the inside and given your other interests and your perspective, sort of how do you think about that?
Well, first of all, I think the most interesting thing, and I'm blessed to have seen the change in Wall Street and financial services over 45 years. And I remember going through the 80s, the M&A boom, followed by the equity boom, followed by the period of the tech boom and bubble. You have to remember, I worked on the Apple IPO. I worked on Apple for quite a few times. Remember, Apple rose and then fell. It was restructured. And then Steve Jobs came back. But one of the things you learn on Wall Street very quickly is, as long as you remember one thing, you're standing, and this is something J.P. Morgan always said, you're standing at the crossroads of capital, between the sources of capital and the uses of capital. So regardless of what happens in terms of geopolitics, regardless of what happens in terms of markets, there's going to be sources of capital to invest. And you're seeing that today with all this money now moving into digital and AI. And there's going to be uses. And you're standing at the crossroads. So whether you're doing an M&A deal, an equity deal, I remember talented people such as yourself would say, is Wall Street no longer a good place for talent? Should we go to private equity? Well, private equity was really just a way of working with companies, with strategies, but doing it in a private way with leverage, and running a private business. And then, of course, you had the evolution of technology, people migrating into the tech space. You saw that into the last 20 years, people wanting to work not necessarily on Wall Street, but in Menlo Park, around the world. And now you basically see people such as ourselves on Wall Street. We continue to play an important role as stewards, if you will, of guardians of sources and uses of capital. And I think that's important. Young people would always say to me, maybe I'm wasting my time on Wall Street. And I'd say, look, it will change. It will, but you will be part of that change.
Mm. You have a line towards the beginning of the book where you ask the reader a series of questions. You say, what frustrates you about the way the world works or doesn't work? What makes you angry about society? Where do you think it might help to disrupt the status quo? And I wonder, how would you answer those questions?
Well, the genesis of those questions is that I would often ask young people, because I originally wrote this book with sort of Generation Z in mind, people between the ages of 15 and 30. And I wrote this book with the view that I said to them, if you wanted to do something for the common good, do something for society, do something for your community, what are you passionate about? Their eyes glazed over and they looked at me like, what do you mean passionate? And I thought, boy, have I got this question wrong. Then they said, we're not philanthropists. We don't have large pools of capital. We're not running big institutions. We don't have a foundation. That must be someone else who can change it. So I had to say, well, wait a minute. You can't rely necessarily on governments. This gets to your question. You can't necessarily rely on corporations. You've got to take a little more personal responsibility. And then I paused and said, okay, so what makes you angry? Immediately you get into climate. You get into the uncertainty of AI. You get into the future of freedom of speech and democracy. You get into a whole range of issues of the state of the world moving from unipolar America to bipolar or multipolar, with China, India, and other people playing a role in the thing. So I think, my ethos has always been focus on human dignity in the individual. That's why I went to Wall Street. I wanted to work with people. I mean, you and I would not have met if we weren't you were interested in interviewing me when you were at the FT. And it was all ultimately about talking about people, leadership, business decisions, and allocation of capital. So I think individuals have got to take responsibility. And we're working in a society today where I think that the Jonathan Haidt's book, The Age of Anxiety, or The Anxious Generation, is a very, very important book because it's a very serious wake-up call. It's not just about mental illness and depression, but it's basically what it really is saying is that there's a generation of people who are forgetting who their identity is and what their talent is, and they're delegating that to the mirror of social media. They're allowing social media to determine what their values are, what's important, what's interesting, who's important, who's powerful, and their identities are being swamped or being eclipsed. And at the end of the day, I'm very positive about social media usage right now and Generation Z, because if you look at the data in the last year or so, it's not just plateauing, but it's starting to decline, where this notion of I'd rather spend more time with Peter one-on-one talking to you, is what I call in the book the power of two, rather than actually being on my social media feed.
But there's an assumption here that this is about bringing about some sort of social change, right? That there are wrongs that need to be righted, or that there are things that need to improved. And I guess I wonder, sort of in terms of how you've approached it, what are the what are the injustices or the things that upset you that you sort of set out to try and address?
Well, I've been working with poverty on, it's now called food security, homelessness, street homelessness, really since I was 6 years old.
What were you doing at 6?
And I touch on it briefly in the book. A member of my family and I organized a small soup kitchen, because it just didn't seem to make sense that lots of people couldn't have access to simple food. And I did that in a church shelter. But it became very clear to me that, and part of it comes from my faith. I was raised with a very strong Christian Catholic family, and I have a very strong view, and I attend Mass daily, and I'm still very focused on the Scriptures as a guide. And there's a wonderful, there's obviously the poor will always be with us, is mentioned many times in the Scriptures, but there's also the notion of to whom much has been given, much is expected. And I really do believe that. And I've been given a lot through my work experience and through my education, and through people I've worked with and I've met. So I have an obligation, there's a quid pro quo, to give it back. To answer your question, one of my great mentors was Mother Teresa, and she always said, you can only change the world one person at a time. And that's so true. And, we have these large-scale programs, metrics, and everything else, but at the end of the day, we're all individuals. And I've discovered this in working with the homeless for 60 years. If you change people one person at a time, that has a multiplier effect, and that impacts exponentially many more people. But you have to focus on the individual, the human element, and it's now something more precious than ever because of AI and how AI could change the whole interface with the human experience. So the book really is trying to help people reclaim their role from a grassroots level and I'm very careful not to use the word activist. You've implied the word activist, and it's a good word, but activist, unfortunately, in the last 20, 30 years, has developed a negative or destructive connotation. I would like it to say that we're all trying to promote what the book says, how to create a more generous society, how to create a more productive society where the humanity of society is protected and preserved, and particularly not ignored.
The other word that you explicitly avoid in the book is the word philanthropy, which surprised me a bit because, I think you're known as a philanthropist, and there's obviously there's this long and vigorous debate about people who've been fortunate, who've generated a lot of wealth, how much of that they should share, and how they should give it back. I just wonder, why would you not try to influence that debate?
First of all, I think those big pools of capital that are arguing to give away half or more than half of their wealth, that's excellent. And that's playing a big role. But that's a small percentage of society when you look at the fact we have over 8 or 9 billion people on the planet today. When I talk to young people and I say, what does philanthropy mean to you? They say, well, doesn't it mean love of mankind? But what does it really mean? It's not about me. That's about someone that's wealthy, someone that's powerful, someone whose name is on a building, someone who's built a university, someone who's built a hospital. But that's not me. So what I've tried to do, and I've been very judicious about not using the word philanthropy, but if I talk about the distinction between charity and philanthropy, do you know what the difference is? It's a very powerful difference. Charity is a transaction. It's sort of giving someone a fish. I'm going to give Peter a fish. I'm going to buy a ticket to your gala dinner. I'm going to give you £10,000. I'm going to make a donation to your charity. And that solves a short-term problem. Charity is necessary. It plays a cornerstone role in society, particularly if you look at food security right now. We need charity to fund food banks. Philanthropy is actually different. It's a secular change in how people think and how people are motivated. It's like teaching people to fish. And that's the difference. And when you talk to young people about that, they're very engaged in that, Peter, because one of the things they're interested in, and they say, well, I don't have a lot of money to give away, but maybe I have an idea, talent, or I have time. And my premise here, and it's true actually, because I've seen so many young people that I've worked with in my Genesis Foundation for the last 25 years, that when you give them some sense of self-esteem and you give them their first break, someone gave you your first break, Peter, right? Someone gave you a first job in media, and that had nothing to do with the money, but it had probably a lot to do with your self-confidence and the ability to get a second and third job. And this is what people are realizing. They have talent and they can do things. And it's interesting. I've now even had parents. The book has only been published since September 18th here in the UK. It's being published on November 18th in New York. But I've had parents call me saying, my adolescent children have read the book and they're actually starting some projects. And it was the fact that the book gave them ideas about their own lives and their own examples. And I've made lots of mistakes in giving. I've trusted the wrong people. Mm-hmm. People were taking advantage of me because I was far too generous at certain points. And that's all fine. You learn, as we all know, the biggest lessons in life you learn from your mistakes, not from your successes.
So what's your own approach then? I mean, I read somewhere that recently that you give away half your income. I mean, is that something that you've always done, or how have you sort of approached it?
Well, I tend to be enthusiastic. If I think I can help someone or help a community, or I can help create a program that's going to have a model or create some systemic change, then for me that's more compelling than buying a buying a car or buying a painting or needing to own something else. I find it more stimulating. And there's a wonderful Herman Melville who wrote Moby Dick. On his gravestone, and in Western Massachusetts, is a wonderful epitaph. You have what you gave, you had what you spent, you lost what you kept. And I think I actually regard, the more I give, I see it as enhancing my own personal spirit and my own personal balance sheet. It's very interesting because I've read that so many times now to young people, and to the point where some people have tears in their eyes because they don't think about giving enough in terms of enriching themselves. It's not really just about giving enriches the giver much more than people realize. And this is where I think in some respects it's potentially more therapeutic than anyone would realize. It's probably more therapeutic than going to the gym or yoga.
We can debate that. But you're very open about your faith, your Catholic faith. It's clearly very important to you. Just, I mean, how do you address people who have different faiths or who have no faith at all?
Well, it's very interesting. I've been on Wall Street for 45 years. Where I take the view that the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity all have a similar origin, from Abraham. I take the view, if you look at Confucian Analects, or if you look at some of the fundamentals of Buddhism or Hinduism, they all have to do with one thing: human dignity and the respect for the individual. And it's interesting, in my career on Wall Street, I have met so many interesting people. There was a very funny story when I was at Blackstone. One day, someone very senior contacted my office, wanted to come visit me. And I politely said, well, no, they shouldn't see me. This was someone called Kwok Song Ing, who was the CIO of GIC. And he was with someone at that point in time was running the country called Lee Kuan Yew. And he said...
And this is Singapore, right? GIC is the big Singaporean fund. Yeah.
Sovereign wealth fund.
Yeah.
So they wanted to come see me while they were in London. And I said politely, you don't want to see me. I'm not the head of Blackstone. You want to see Mr. Schwartzman. And they said, no. My secretary came back, they said they want to see you. Well, I said, well, okay, but I don't. So I arrive in the meeting, just the three of us, and they said, look, we understand you're a very devout Christian, and you meditate, and you're very generous with your time. Could you talk about your prayer and your meditation to us? And we spent an hour talking about, and I said, first of all, I said, how did you know about this? And they said, well, another business person in Asia had told them this. And they said, we wanted to meet you. And now I've established a relationship with Kwok Sung. Last year he ran for president against Tarman. But it was fascinating. That's one example. And Peter, I've had so many examples where people have been curious about my faith and have asked to see me because they were curious about their own prayer, their own meditation, or their own relationship with a greater being. So I think it's important to focus on the similarities. It's actually some of the messages during the recent visit that King Charles had with His Holiness Pope Leo. The message there was to focus on the similarities that the Christian faiths share and all faiths share, as opposed to focusing almost exclusively, which people often like to do, on the differences.
That unfortunate business back in the 16th century. I mean, it's quite a big thing. I just want to just to finish off. You are very well known as a sort of consummate networker. Your Rolodex must have this vast array of contacts, CEOs and financiers, as you mentioned, but also politicians and artists and all kinds of other people. I just wonder, sort of, have you made a business of that? I mean, it's obviously important for your job, but what's your approach there? Do you do you work at it? How does it work?
I'm interested in people for who they are. And I think if you have a genuine curiosity as to what makes people tick, and the most important thing I would say is you need to get to spend time with people one-on-one. You don't get to know people. You don't build trust. You don't build rapport. You don't build chemistry in spending time with people. And one of the things is people are very interested in meeting other people. And one of the things I have a good intuition when it comes to convening. And quite often, people will rely on me to introduce me to other people. There's a number of people I know very well who are now in very senior positions around the world. And they'll call me and say, do you know so-and-so? And I'll say, I do. And they say, Could you introduce me? And I say, I don't need to be involved, and I also don't need to know why you need to want to talk to them, but I will. So I think if you can benefit people by connecting them with other people, it's not about collecting people. I think the word networking has a terrible connotation, and it sounds like you collect people in order to show them off with your Rolodex. I think you get to know people because they're interesting, and sometimes you can bring things to their life, their business, their family. But also, the biggest gift you can give people is to introduce them to other people. So I've always naturally seen that. Maybe this goes back to my mother tells a story. I came home the second day of first grade, and my mother said, "Well, tell me about some of the people in your class." And I said, "Well, there are 22," and I talked about 2 or 3 of them. And then I looked at her and I said, I was 6 years old. I said, "Oh, I'm glad you want to meet them, because you'll meet them next Monday night. I've invited them all to dinner." She, of course, smiled and said, "Fine." But I even when at the age of 6, I said, I've invited my whole first grade class to supper at home. So I had a sense of wanting to get to know them better and wanting them to get to know my mother and father. So maybe there's a gene or something that encourages people to be interested in other people, hospitality, generosity. I think it's curiosity too.
Okay. We have to leave it there, John, but this has been really fascinating. So thank you very much for coming.
Peter, thank you. Thank you for your interest.
That's our show this week. Thanks to John for coming into the studio to share his views, and as always, thanks to you for tuning in. This podcast was produced by Oliver Taslich in London. You can listen to a new episode of The Big View every Tuesday, and don't forget to tune into our sister show Viewsroom every Thursday, as well as all the other great podcasts from the Reuters team. To get in touch with feedback, questions, and ideas, please email us on breakingviews-podcasts@tr.com. That's breakingviews-podcasts@tr.com. If you liked what you heard, please rate the show and leave us a review, and check out our views on the biggest stories in business and finance every day at breakingviews.com and reuters.com.